David, my first question is for you. So I'm curious. I love learning about your role, and it's super unique because you run this self-serve motion like a growth team. Do you think that we'll see more of this in PLG? Have you seen other companies run their self-service business like Grafana, or is this very unique to you? And maybe at DigitalOcean as well?
Yeah, it's kind of different. So DigitalOcean, like just going on that one first, DO is like a pure product-led company. Like I don't think it's like understood enough, like even in the public markets, about like trying to figure out a sales motion is something that is an evolution there. And then when we talked about PLG, and like Aaron can talk, for days on this, that it really is this success motion. It's like, how are we adding value as a human being to help them like solve their infrastructure challenges, whatever it might be. It looks a little bit like support, looks a little bit like success. And sure, the sales component is like, how do we get you into this new car and start spending more money, right? But it's like in that order, I think, is the important part. It's interesting because we're open source, just like as Aaron mentioned, where there's already this motion, like it's already PLG, right? Like where there's this wide distribution because Grafana is for free and available across the internet for millions of developers. So we've got that motion going, massive adoption over the years. And like most open source companies, we've monetized early on the enterprise end, right? We have a lot of success on that motion, the more sales driven side. But I think because we've had those two motions that existed, figuring out how do we put a disproportionate amount of effort into the SaaS, in my mind, PLG means like put a credit card and spend some money or experience something for free. That didn't totally exist in a major way going back a few years. So I think there's probably roles that look a lot like mine and other companies that are adopting this process, but I don't suspect it's companies who've started right out of the gate. Like most companies nowadays are starting right out of the gate with some sort of PLG motion, I think. So I think for folks that have been around, the company's existed for some time, and there's already an enterprise motion, I think you probably see more folks that look like this small self-serve business unit, might be how we talk about it.
That makes sense. Thank you for sharing. I want to dive really quickly into PQLs, but let's just get into it because that's the topic of the discussion. I think it's a very hot topic right now, but a lot of companies thinking about it differently. And what I've seen at Focus and with customers that we're working with and others in the community, there seems to be three different categories of PQLs. There's the product engagement piece, there's the customer fit piece, and then there's buying intent. And then you're able to segment those PQLs based on what are the goals of your organization? What customer segments do you have? What roles need access to PQLs? So I'd love to hear from you all how you define PQLs at your respective companies and what frameworks you use to define those. And maybe we can go in the same order I went before, from Jen to David to Aaron.
Sure. And just so everyone knows timeline-wise, it's where we are in our journey versus my fellow panelists here, because I think we're a little bit earlier. We launched our free product at the beginning of November. And so we didn't have to define a PQL until November. And so for us, there's basically two criteria. Did they take the action that allows them to use the product and share the product once they get in there and sign up? And are they in our ICP? And that's a PQL. We toss it over the fence to sales and hope that they do magic at that point.
Awesome. David and Aaron, I'd love to hear from both your time together at DigitalOcean and now at your two other companies.
You got this, Aaron.
Oh man. So yeah, DigitalOcean, right? So, we define PQLs in a number of different ways. And Dave, I can't remember how many times we went back and forth. We probably had 40 over the couple of years that we built and scrapped and reiterated on. No true free plan, right? Because you might get a small credit, but what we looked for is identifying trends amongst customers, right? I was the first true rep at DigitalOcean, and I joined at a very late stage, right? And so it was really interesting to start talking to folks that have been on the platform for years. And so we developed PQLs to identify who we should talk to. And once we started noticing trends that, folks that are adding multi-products or scaling in certain ways, and they became large expansion customers and ones that we wanted to latch onto, and some of them ended up being our top customers at the end of the day, we really started to define that motion. And so we really looked for folks that are coming in, doing exciting things, and that took lots of iteration, especially when the funnel looks to be about like 1,000 new signups a day. Really healthy place to be. At Cypress, having a free plan and a self-serve product, we started to look at both sides of the funnel to say, what are our free users doing that's interesting? How do we target them? How do we speak with them? What do we learn from that? And then on the paid side, what are the other exciting things, right? Are they going into consumption billing? Are they adding multiple tests? Are they actually not using the product the way they should be? And then we identify them as triggers, send them over to MDRs on the free side, sales on the paid side, and sort of watch the magic happen from there.
Nice. Yeah. And just to kind of build on some of the things Aaron mentioned at our time at DigitalOcean, we were trying to go after this like years ago. We were fortunate to both like either work directly for or closely with this woman, Emmanuel, who leads success over at Toast now, kind of like brought this concept up to us of like, hey, we don't do traditional selling at DigitalOcean because it's a pure consumption product that people come on. Let's scrap MQLs. That's like not the right terminology, number one, right? Because there's no marketing relation. These are paying customers of ours. So like, how do we know the right signals or triggers to reach out to? So for years, we kind of just referred to them as triggers. And then there was some good branding some folks started doing around PQLs that we adopted that terminology. So we were both just fortunate to work with someone who's like very like forward thinking on this and sort of got us on the right path a little while ago on it. And it's kind of where it all starts. Like, and I'll talk a little more about my experience at Grafana, but at DO, it was like just triggers. It was like, all right, the following person does X amount of things within Y amount of time, right? Things we were writing in SQL to like figure out like, what does this look like? And then figure out how to work with someone to automate it, right? So that would be one example. And my experience now at Grafana, just kind of contrast that or show how similar it is to some extent with DigitalOcean. We think about the world like, well, just because someone's a qualified lead in our mind doesn't mean like they have any interest in chatting with us. So like the hardest part I found, and there's maybe like a different tangent to go on here, is like, we try to use some sort of qualification of like, might they have any interest in chatting with us? And is it not just us wanting to talk to them? Because I'd argue we sort of struggle with the same problem that like you deal with in sales and other places of just because you have thousands or hundreds or tens of thousands of people using your product, and you think they're interesting doesn't mean they want to talk to you at all. And I think that is like what I found is one of the unique challenges. So it's like all these triggers of product usage or their demographics and all the like lead scoring style stuff. I don't have a good answer for this, right? Just like an important like philosophical thing we care about is like, let's also only reach out to the people who probably could find value from talking to us.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Something that has been sticking with me since the beginning of what you all both said is we heard from Jen, we keep it simple. We have one PQL. We just launched our free product. Let's do it. And then I heard from Aaron at DigitalOcean, we must have had 40. How many PQL should you have?
It's a great question. I think it also depends on the complexity of your product, right? If you think about DigitalOcean, right, they have many different features, functionalities, products, different ICPs, different types of customers. And so it just got complex in the sense that we wanted to explore different things. I'm pretty sure last time I checked, they're like down to 10 again. So they've really, cooled it off. They're probably laughing at Dave and I now. But, we were interested in just like, hey, it was early days. We have the ability to test multiple things. So let's go and see what it looks like, right? If a customer is using droplets and spaces, when you're pairing servers and storage together, you're most likely building in production. So why are you doing that? Let's talk to you and understand why. Here at Cypress, we've probably got around 6 today, and that grows and shrinks depending on the month. Alexa, you and I have talked in depth about this in our time together. And so I think it really depends on a couple of things, like what you're looking for. We do something unique, and Dave and I experimented a little bit with this at DO, is we bring demographic data in too, because I'm equally as interested in who the person is. I see a lot of times some folks are just looking at product data, and so I think our scope expands a bit because we're looking at more of the demographic side as well, especially here at Cypress.
So it sounds to me that the line of our definition is a little different. So here's how I think about it. What is the thing there? And we have one action right now, effectively. I mean, yes, it takes some time to get there, but we effectively have one path. When you sign up for starter, as we call it, you are going to make what we call a replay. When you publish it, suddenly you must be at least somewhat qualified, or at least you've gotten to the point that you can share it. If we had 12 products, we would probably have 12 different definitions of what that final trigger was, right? What's the final trigger to get over the fence? Then it gets qualified by ICP, and then it gets segmented. And so we don't define a different PQL by segment, because to me, at that point, that's like a lead routing issue more than it is like a definition issue.
Interesting.
Yeah, it makes sense. And when we were at DO, or a little bit of what we're seeing at Grafana, there's like a couple different buckets. So yeah, it goes up from like 2 or 3 all the way up to 10s. And like what I've seen from like an organizational pressure standpoint is, well, you want to like figure out what the hell is going to work. Like we start early, we'll have like a million things, and then you like open up this funnel, or you have too many people that are considered PQL, and like there's not enough noise. And then you like swing the pendulum to be like, all right, like let's just pick the 1 or 2 things, and then there's like 0 volume, and then you like figure out how to go back and forth. So like in my experience, that's a real thing of like super tight constraints, like opening up. That's one. This other bit that's a little nuanced is like in DO, we saw this where we're looking for people who are like showing real signs they might scale, or like because they have scale, they have more complexity, so they might value from speaking to us. But I think the other one that's interesting, and we spend some more time doing this here, is like something that looks like proactive support at the end of the day. Like, can we add value with a human being We couldn't give you via email, right? Like we couldn't trigger an email to do this. We'll see you're like visiting certain types of support pages or whatever it might be, or you generated an API key and didn't do the following thing, like you're stuck. And other than just triggering an email to you, like speaking with a human might help you. So that's another part of my mind. So like demographics, all obviously the product behavior, but then there's the like trying to do something, but like not knowing how to, I think is also part of this equation.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is it could be based on kind of what the goal is of a team or the end user. So maybe one of your goals is I want to make sure I'm proactively reaching out to folks that are on the self-serve product but are stuck. So we'll have a PQL there. But then there's also a PQL for folks that maybe are already paying on a lower tier plan and you think that they have upsell potential. So your PQLs are defined based on what those kind of motions or goals are. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very well said.
Cool. And it sounds like Jen's is based on product. It's like this thing happened. We have one product, we have one premium product. We are in the early days, so we are confident about the PQL motion for this one thing. And then
confident is putting it a little high here. So we don't have enough data to be confident yet.
Fair. It's been 4 months. And then Aaron at Cypress, you have it based on, it almost sounds like different segments of the business, and then similar to what David has at Grafana.
Yeah, I'll give you an example, right? If a large company in our ICP signs up and, I saw somebody from Rainforest here, so you probably understand this. If they're running a low amount of tests, but they have a really big front end, right? We can assume that they're either just poking around or not fully onboarded or need to work on adoption, right? And so we pair like, hey, large company, right, fits our ICP, and also low usage together to say, hey, there's a lot more we could be doing with these folks. Let's reach out. It becomes much more of like the idea of solution selling rather than like your old, I grew up as a cold caller, right? So I remember those days of like really trying to force the marketing message down. And, I think we've really adapted to this idea of solution selling of much more of how can we help, right? We want you to do more with us. Of course, that leads to more dollars, but it's a much more healthier conversation than like trying to show value and go right to decision makers and for lack of a better term, like force a solution on somebody versus like naturally letting them on board in the right way.
I love it. There's a really good question in the chat by Eddie. How often do you change your PQL qualifications? Was that cycle different from when you first started your PLG motion?
I'm like, we don't know yet. Hey, my gut is like, let's evaluate every quarter and see what we get. I think the other two probably have better answers here.
Yeah, like maybe not better, just different, right? So Aaron and I can go where we talk a bunch about at DigitalOcean, this story. It was fairly often, daily, not quarterly after a while. We'd introduce new ones, but we'd be like hesitant to kill things on the cadence of more often than every quarter. Mostly because, and I don't know if this is a segue, so we don't have to go into it, but we could. I'm like, well, how do we know if these things are working, right? Like, how do we test? It's like a good use of the time. Interesting topic. So like how we did at DigitalOcean as an example was we just like held holdout groups. We said, here's a PQL, they did the following thing, this trigger, we're going to like put them in front of Aaron's team, and then we're going to hold out the other 50%. We're going to measure what happens. And again, it's there's no commit here, right? This is usage-based pricing. We're going to look what happens on that audience over the course of 1-2 quarters and like see what the impact is. And that's how we were able. So we always said like, we want to make sure not remove PQLs. Maybe we needed to give it 3 or 6 months, just to be totally honest, because we felt we had to have this type of view. And it was the nuances of our product. All products are different. Ours was a long game. And that's how we were able to do it. That sounds really cool, and we sound like intelligent about like how we set it up. It doesn't mean that we were able to get crystal clarity on like this was effective or this wasn't, right? Like we were constantly looking at ourselves and debating with executives on like, well, these results look interesting, but like what if you dig under the hood and would this have happened anyway? And just because they spoke to you, when are they going to have done it, right? It's like very, very nuanced. That was maybe more than we were looking for, but that was basically how we thought about our cadence.
I want to hear from Aaron, but I also quickly want to learn, how did you say we were measuring success every 3 to 6 months to see how effective the PQL was compared to just remaining in self-serve? What data were you looking at? Were you seeing how much quicker they converted, the quicker time to value, the increase of ARR? Like what were those metrics?
Aaron, you want to take that one?
Sure. No, this is such a, Alexa, you and I have talked about this in depth, right? One of the biggest things we had to prove at DO was like, are we doing better than self-serve? Because then you're deploying a bunch of sales resources at something that's going to happen anyway. And that was always the big question. And right away, I think our first PQL day was the 48-hour spike, right? It's still around today. It's still very high performing at DigitalOcean, right? When someone comes in and their usage dramatically spikes up, let's talk to them, understand why. And the questions we started asking, or for the data team started asking, was, do we convert them faster to larger customers? Does their ASP increase? And does churn over time decrease? And what we found was, when those things started to become true, we were onto something, right? And then small tweaks would sort of come from there. But as long as we were beating, we always A/B tested, right? We've also talked a lot about this, right? We would do something around 60-40 to sales, or 75-25, because we want to understand, what's that control group look like? Because if we weren't, like I said, we're probably focusing on the wrong things, and then we're giving sales credit for motions with a segment that would happen anyway. And so I think those metrics really stand out. Here at Cypress, we sort of take a similar route to understand, what does the ASP look like? Would they have upgraded anyway and spent more with us? And as we continue to prove that wrong or right, we tweak and adjust based on those metrics that we're pulling, basically on a weekly basis at this point.
That's interesting to me, just because we don't have a self-serve upgrade path between, the lower tier starter plus, as we call it, and the full platform. So that would be an impossible way for us to measure. So for us, it's like pure play conversion rate at first, and then obviously subjective feedback, because sales will whine at me. Sorry, I've got a sales rep or two here on the call. I probably shouldn't whine about them. And then, obviously time to close is probably the next thing we'd look at.
I love it. So there's a consistent theme of, we want to A/B test this and make sure that our sales motion, or using PQLs to power sales teams, that is beating the self-serve engine. Otherwise, leave it to self-serve. And when I say beating, it sounds like you're both doing A/B testing with, take maybe a cohort of users, cut them in half for 3 months, and say, we're going to try sales reps in these PQLs, leave the others to self-serve, and then make sure that it beats it. And then we can program that as a longer term PQL. Did I explain that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the nuances, because we talk about errors and like PQLs, so it's like, it's not like a score, at least from my experience, we haven't like implemented as a score like the old fashioned way. That they are sort of like these discrete things. It's like the action X, action Y, whatever it might be. And I think we did see at our time at DO, you had to look at the results, like the hypothesis different for each, right? So as I already mentioned, there was this like immediate, you start spiking up, that's like one behavioral trigger. There might be another one. And like in one of those scenarios, the success metric might be that we were able to like convert them to a contract, right? And one might be that we actually reduced churn over some period of time, which was a little bit more helpful. And again, it was pure usage-based pricing. So it's a little different about how we might think about the world, but that's another thing worth considering, that like, hey, not all these things are created equal. They like have these slightly different intent. Very
interesting. And when you experimented with those different triggers, as you called it at DO and now PQLs, did you give it to every sales rep? Like, run free, tell me like if these PQLs work, like how did you do that?
It's a great question. We actually kept it really small, especially in the early days, because we had one rep. He's actually now here with me at Cypress, so I have a tendency to do that. But he understood what we were trying to do, and I think when the team became 5, 6, 7, 8 reps, right, to deploy a PQL across that consistency, you're going to get different messages, you're going to have different phone calls. And so we really wanted to get that small control group with new PQLs, give it to 1 or 2 people that really understood our sort of mission. Sometimes we would split different groups of PQLs between different groups of people, then work with them on that initiative. But it really helped to keep it smaller rather than disperse across the whole team and sort of have to work across a number of people rather than a small control group. Once we confirmed that things were sort of working the way they were intended and there was no hiccups, then we'd start to release to the bigger team, work on enablement, onboarding, and sort of let them run from there.
I love it. Anyone else have a different perspective on that?
Well, there was a question in the chat. Like, so we have a very large sales org. Like first off, we're like new to like we're framing it as PQLs here, right? Like, so we're actually very early in the journey here and how we talk about it. But one of my big takeaways from my experience at DigitalOcean, which again was like pure product led, trying to figure out the sales motion on top of that, where here was the opposite, right? Like we understood sales motion going up, was like, how do we actually service these customers that come through self-service? And I think for me, working with Aaron for all that amount of time, and then you look at like the hyperscalers, like the Amazons of the world as an example, and what you really found was like you were supplying, and we're a very technical business focused on software developers and DevOps and so on, where actually the unique value we were able to offer to customers in a self-serve setting is actually around like technical support, solutions engineering, sales engineering. And that's the approach we take for the most, one of the things we do here, we do a bunch of different things, but where I spend a lot of my time specifically on this is actually the people we're having reach out to. A lot of these people that we're referring to as PQLs are people that we refer to as like success engineers before we pass anyone to the sale. So that happens to be a very, very small group on my team. So it sort of keeps that as instead of being widespread, it's just, a handful of people today. So we have a slightly different approach to the market of just like, we just want to educate customers on a very technical product first and foremost. And then, we figure how we interact with sales.
It's interesting because it's persona based then, because we sell to sales and marketing people.
Right.
And so that's a very different sales motion than I had when I was at AWS and we were doing the developer route, right? Which was far more similar to exactly what you described.
Right.
And as such, right now we're treating PQLs the same as MQLs and basically putting them into the round robin or the whatever my sales office is set up for lead assignment. But I also know that we're talking to maybe a sales engineer or product marketer, or it could be a VP of sales, or it could be somebody in marketing, right? Like we know our personas and they're more likely to not get pissed off at us by taking a phone call.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
Yeah, totally.
I have a spicy question for you all that I'm hoping sparks some debate. So we have a salesperson, a self-service person, and a marketer. Who owns PQLs? Jen owns all of the PQLs.
I have extreme ownership. Fundamentally, so there's who has owned the product, who has owned the go-to-market, and who has owned PQLs. And we've gone on a bit of a journey. Once upon a time, before I started at Reprise, because I started last summer, the product owned it, because they were literally building it. So it made sense for them to own it. And then we had to launch it. And I negotiated out what a PQL was with the head of sales. In fact, I did it on camera in front of everybody that we put out as a reality show. So that one's a fun one, and you can probably even find it and see how just crazy we were. Then sales owned the whole project for a while we tried not to scare the crap out of our sales folks by bringing in a product-led motion on top of their enterprise sales motion. Then ops had to own it for a while because we needed to put in the credit card and we needed to make sure all the data flows were working. But as of Tuesday, literally 2 days ago, marketing now owns the entire thing, including, and which gives us full autonomy over what a PQL is. We actually have now orchestrated it completely in HubSpot, and then we're passing it over to Salesforce appropriately to get it into the sales team and with the routing that we have through Lean Data. And it's all mine, which means that I could go completely cowboy here and just find a PQL as whatever the heck I want. Now, I'm not a complete idiot all of the time. And so I plan to actually watch it and make sure that I can get the right signal from product if I want a signal, that sales actually knows what the heck just happened to this lead that just fell into their lap, because otherwise they can't nurture it correctly. But that's long story longer. That was our journey to marketing owning basically the whole shebang.
And you combine MQLs and PQLs into one score, it sounds like.
No, we toss them both over the fence into the same bucket, kind of, but they're two different orchestra funnels. We also have, and I was really happy to hear David say this, like we have simple definitions of MQLs and PQLs. Marketers over-engineer MQLs all the time. Well, if they did this white paper and then they did that, and then they saw these 3 web pages, they're suddenly magically ready to be sold to, is usually a bunch of crap.
Yeah.
And I think we can easily do the exact same thing with PQLs. Well, if they clicked here in the product and they did this and they did that. And so we're working with product to set up what are the milestones if we need to do something other than the one we have currently set up.
Yeah, the last point you brought up, I think is like so spot on. It's like so easy to overcomplicate it. Good for decent reason under the hood is like there's some element, but when interacting with sales, I think the most common is like, okay, why? Like, why are they this? Like, why are they triggered? Or whatever it might be. And they're usually looking for like a moment or a milestone to be like, well, they did the following, right? They did X in the product. So I agree with you.
So it's not as spicy as we wanted, I guess.
Well, I want to know, David, who owns it?
Cool. Yeah. So I think Grafana's maybe I'll give some perspective there. I think so. DO is marketing, right? Because there wasn't. Like the whole business was a self-serve business, wasn't product, right? So I think in that regard, it wasn't product, it was marketing. Like our marketing growth team, however we want to frame it, like was responsible for it, right? Like we partnered with sales. And just like I think with MQLs, as an example, Aaron or whoever would be like, oh, Dave, this sucks, right? Stop sending me these, right? The loop is there. Here, Grafana, it's a little nuanced. It's like, I don't know if it would apply for everyone because my team looks a little more like a product, like a growth product team in that regard. I think it just sort of matters. It depends. Like our marketing team is there to help generate a lot of demand for sales. And because we don't pass anyone but our hand raisers, like we can talk about hand raisers as a separate bucket. Our marketing teams are for that. Like, how do we drive people to raise their hand and talk to sales and so on and so forth? But this like proactive, we are initiating a conversation sort of lives in this growth org, but that's a journey, right? I imagine we'll change our mind if this sticks over time.
Yeah, I like how you said partnered. Glad you put it that way, so we don't have to argue too much. But interesting here at Cypress, I was sort of like first in seat amongst the RevOps group, the marketing group, and I did a panel with OpenView a few months back, and I think we decided that RevOps now owns QLs because they seem to sit in the middle and can be a liaison to helping create these things across the product team, the data team. Data team is a really important piece to PQLs in my past. And we'll talk about break fix hopefully in a minute because we kept pointing fingers across and that was always fun. But I think there's a lot of influence from other groups. And I think it's less important on who owns it, but that person does need to take responsibility for it because until the PLG tools like Pocus and others came along, this is a pretty crazy process to manage depending on how you're pulling the data, right? And so, nowadays we sort of pin this on RevOps to own the process. And there's a lot of influence coming from internal teams such as marketing, product, data, and sales. So sort of a combined effort to partner on building these and maintaining them.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting challenge, like where it sits now is another, I don't know if that's the most important one. The question is like, who's being held accountable for what? I think it really matters at the end of the day. And like that, I think with PLG, as a go-to-market, I've seen it look really different across, like it was different at DO, it was very different here, even from everyone who's on the call, I think probably structures their team differently. Like what they hold their head of marketing accountable for is different than others. When we were at DigitalOcean, just for context, there would always be this question, like who owns revenue in a pure PLG business when there's no salespeople? Like it's a really, by the way, strange question to have to address. And I think that's why we would look at marketing, but well, marketing is going to hold some attribution toward some aspect of revenue.
Yeah.
So I think it's like as the executive team getting good alignment on like who do you hold accountable for like getting people over to sales? I think often looks like marketing, right? Or RevOps is like the at a minimum the piping for that. That's usually my take. I think RevOps, at least from what I said, is like often a piping function. But I've seen companies who looked at it as like a very strategic, like goal setting function.
I love all of the points and what I'm hearing, and actually very consistent to what I've seen amongst several PLG companies is it's a team sport. There's going to be someone who's accountable, but there's many people who have input and need to be either defining the PQLs, which comes from input from product and growth and RevOps and data and sales leadership, and then acting on the PQLs is the sales team, and then actually piping it as RevOps. So yes, I agree with George. It's a cross-function task force, but it's really important that someone's accountable because if no one's accountable, then nothing will happen. But there always is that feedback loop going from, and I like how you talked about that at DO, David and Aaron, where you would create a PQL, feed it to Aaron. Aaron would say like, what is this crap? And then you'd have to rebuild the model. And like, that's kind of how it like gets more robust over time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love Jill's question. For David and Aaron, how does the open source offering factor into your PQL program, if at all?
Or you want to go? I think there's still an internal debate on whether we call these things PQLs. I tend to just group everything under a PQL, mainly because I love them. But I do think they make sense, right? And so one of the things we've started doing is we're using a series of tools to understand who our open source users are. One of them I'll call it out because I love it is Clay.run. Actually, thank you, Dave, for that introduction. And they've got a great tool where I can scrape my GitHub users into Clay, and then I can push that to a system where I'm understanding who they are. And so then what I do is I group pairings of open source users together and compare it to free users. And so if I'm seeing a correlation of multiple signups on the open source side, we're getting the stars from our GitHub users, and then they're also signed up for a free plan, then they're also using the product, we're signaling out as a PQL. And so we absolutely consider the open source data. You need to be careful. I was very against, and so was our leadership team in the early days of just messaging the open source users without them having signed up for the product, because then you're like blurring the line of like getting a little creepy and being a little too aggressive. And so when we see some trends, we like to think like, hey, if they're signing up for the product, they've been all over the open source side, that's a really good sign. Let's reach out now, versus like somebody stars your GitHub and you're cold calling them. So we generally take like a paired approach where we're combining a bunch of data to get a PQL from that.
Yeah, and on my end, it's probably a little different in that our marketing team might be leveraging some of this information in some of their outreach. I think we think about the word a little idealistically of like, yeah, we just want to get as many people to raise their hand, right? And then we don't have to feel like we're annoying anyone. Like, I know that sounds stupid, but like, wouldn't that be great for all of us? Anyone who's a marketer or growth or salesperson, we just have more people raising their hand to talk to us. I think we do what we can to figure out how we can drive more of that. From where I sit, I typically stay away out of like not thinking about open source, but incorporating any of that data into sort of like qualification, because we're mostly just looking at our SaaS product. So that's very much like a driver and distribution mechanism. And we have a ton of adoption there, but we, for the most part, keep that out of my universe, at least.
Cool. Love it. Switching gears a little, are any other teams besides sales teams using PQLs?
Yes. This is
Leading
new.
Question.
Yes. This is new. So recently we've partnered up with the customer success team to also have, we've sort of rebranded internally so we don't get confused, but we're calling them like CSQLs, which are essentially PQLs for CS. And so how that works is sales continues to own all revenue. We really didn't want to create that blurred line. Like I've seen in the past, it gets a little like, hey, this is my deal versus yours. And we wanted to stray away from that. And so in this case, CS owns the top book of business here at Cypress. And we have PQLs set up where if there's a, whatever the trigger may be, they'd get alerted, they'd reach out, have a conversation, understand, what may be going on. If there's an expansion play, they'll bring back in sales. We launched this 2 months ago and it's been working really, really well, and also helps sales focus on the smaller customers, the PQLs that are more geared at like the folks that just signed up versus customers who have been here for 4 or 5 years. And so we've really leaned on the CS team to drive the expansion revenue over to sales, and happy to report it's working quite well thus far. So
I have a question. Sorry to interrupt there, but and that is that is that actually different from what they were doing before? Because most CS teams I've worked with, the way that they learn to land and expand is they look at product signals, right? In fact, they were the first people to look at product signals before marketing ever even thought about it, right? And so are you simply using the term now, expansion PQL or whatever that is, for something that they were already doing?
Yeah, I think a little bit, right? I think the caveat there is like a lot of times all of our product data is buried, right? We use a number of tools where sometimes it's a little more difficult to navigate what you may be looking for. You might have to log into Cypress itself or use something like Appendo to go out and get that data. And so I think our attempt here was to bubble it up in a way that it's more deliberate to say, hey, these folks have done this and it's really exciting. I'll give you an example. If somebody adds 30 users, right, or their test usage spikes up 150%, we're going to want to talk to them. And the way to find that in the past would be a lot more difficult to like navigate a book of 100 accounts versus like, hey, prioritize these folks first because they're doing these interesting things. And so it just helps us get what we're looking for immediately versus like digging into the data itself, which has always been a problem. Dave, our systems at DigitalOcean were always difficult to navigate. So this has made it a bit easier to do and conduct that outreach.
That makes sense. It's just that usually when people come up to me, marketers come up to me and they're like, how do I define a PQL? I'm like, go talk to CS, because they already know what pieces of the product are sticky, right? Like they already know what the aha moments are, probably in a way beyond sales, right? Because they know what actually tends to work. And yes, that's assuming you have something like Appendo and you have the data to actually look at. Right. So I was bemused to hear it go the other, like in my brain, the other direction.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think especially Cypress, right? We've got, a much smaller base of paid customers than a DigitalOcean that had, 2 million, customers in the database. And so, when there's a larger pool, it becomes a lot trickier, which is why we use so many triggers over there. And here, we can be a little bit more deliberate with how we set things up.
I think the point around like CS people already doing this is such a great point. I think maybe what's different now versus in the past is it's pay as you go, like, or at least like our time at DigitalOcean was like, there's not a contract. There's like, how do we go and learn what they're doing so we can make sure they stick around, we can renew them for another year, where it's like, yeah, they're paying us this month, but they might not paying us next month. And I think it's like kind of and that candidly, we have this debate here all the time at DigitalOcean. We have this of like, this is pre-sales, this is post-sales, what the hell is this? That like notion doesn't totally exist if it's pay as you go, in my mind. And that's where it's like, who reaches out? Success. Like DigitalOcean was like sort of a success motion. Here, it's probably even more of a technical success motion, at least today. I don't know. There's something in that like circle between pre-sales and post-sales that is, I think, the problem we're trying to all figure it out for sure.
And it's not unique to product-led growth. In that, when I worked at Madison Logic, we weren't SaaS, right? People did things with IOs. So when I said, who are our customers? They said, you mean this month? Right? Because it was who was paying us this month. And CS was a sales word because of that. Like they were all rolled together. It's not a new problem. We just almost have new definitions and it's a little more technical now.
Yeah, that's well said.
And David, I love the point around pre versus post sale, because I think the lines get blurred in PLG with maybe before was owning just account health and churn prevention, and maybe expansion and upsell was the AE, or maybe it's sales assist. Like who owns going from free to paid and then paid to the bigger paid? And so we all need to figure out, like, should that be a CSQL or a PQL? And I think it's differ by organization. We probably have one more question. Aaron, how are you alerting your CS team of CSQLs?
Using Salesforce right now to push a notification to the CS team. It bubbles up to them as a task. They'll reach out, and then if there's an opportunity, they'll create an opportunity, pass it back over to sales, tag themselves as the CSM, and then we have a mechanism where it gets flagged as a CSQO, CS qualified opportunity. A lot of terms flying around. We'll have to get like a definition sheet at some point.
I'd love it. All right, in the last 3 minutes, for all of you, I'd love to hear from each of you. What is one thing you want to leave with the group for folks that are defining PQLs, operationalizing them, or experimenting with them? What is your number one golden rule or recommendation piece of advice?
Start simple. You don't need to go with 8 billion triggers.
I like it.
Patience. You probably won't see results right away. You need to tweak your messaging, right? One thing we've recently done is work with marketing. We're seeing an increase in reply rate, right? And so sometimes the reps will have a different tone than how the business perceives reaching out to these folks. And of course, folks in marketing always have a much nicer way of talking to folks rather than salespeople. I'll admit to that as a salesperson. So patience is definitely one.
Yeah, and like those are all good. Like on the pragmatic theme, I think it's like really aligning with whoever, whether it be head of sales, marketing, product, on like, what are we trying to achieve with this? Like, what is it that we actually want to do? Are we just like trying to put more people in front of sales? That's a different problem to solve than, are we a pay-as-you-go business where we're trying to convert people into a commitment? Like, I think really get clear on like, what is it that we're trying to do? Like, what does the end result look like if this goes well? Because it's easy to get lost in the like product data and modeling this data and then figure out how the hell to get it into sales. Like they're becoming solved problems, right? But like the pragmatic questions are particularly hard.
I love it. All right, so keep it simple, be patient, and experiment over time, and make sure it's cross-functional effort and you have everyone's buy-in and you're building something that the whole team finds valuable. Thank you all so much. This was incredible. I feel like we just did like speed round of PQLs, but we got through so many amazing topics. You all are incredible, and I appreciate the unique insights from each of your different businesses. So really appreciate you being here. For anyone else on this call, if you want to continue to have these conversations, you can request an invite to our community at pocus.com/community. And Jen, David, and Aaron, anything else you want to share before we sign off?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know there's a lot of great resources that on the Pocus site, so go check them out. I've worked with a lot of good stuff there. So
yeah, I will say in our recent product-led sales playbook, which you can find on our website, Aaron wrote an entire piece on PQLs, how they defined it at Cypress, as well as an actual document that you can download as a template for defining PQLs. So thank you all, everyone. Have an incredible rest of your day and good luck with your PQLs.